So we're very happy to have Emily Diana here. Emily's a research assistant professor here at TTIC, joined us, I guess, this past September. Unfortunately for us, only here for a year, and then she'll be going to the Tepper School of Business at CMU. So Emily's going to talk to us about balance filtering. You can read it, but balance filtering via disclosure-controlled proxies.
All right, let's do that. Turn this on. All right. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. So I'd like to start out with a couple of examples. So data quality and machine learning ethics has been in the news quite a bit recently. The gender shade study from 2018 has been quite famous. So Joy Mily, pictured here, was a student at the MIT Media Lab. And in 2018, she was playing around with some commercially available gender classification software that one of her colleagues was using. And she was dismayed to find that the software, which was supposed to detect a face and then decide whether it was male or female, didn't even detect her face until finally she put on a white mask. So she didn't jump to any conclusions. She thought, okay, maybe it's just some peculiarity about this specific software. So she tried 3 others, and she found that 2 out of the 4 didn't detect her face at all, and the other 2 misgendered her. So again, it's very easy to sit here and think that someone behind the scenes was kind of malicious and was saying, okay, if you see this type of face, let's just ignore it. That's very unlikely. When she actually looked into the data, she found that, for one thing, although these systems claim very high accuracy, if you actually broke it down into different subgroups, they did very, very well on white men. I think close to 100% accuracy, maybe like 97%. And then on black women, some of them were no better than a coin flip if they detected the face. And when you actually look at this data, it's composed of almost like 75% white people, 80% men. So this is an example, and I won't really be talking about fairness in this talk, but it's an example of how kind of data quality issues can have maybe social consequences. And we might really desire data that's well balanced and of high quality. And then we've also been very concerned about privacy for quite a long time. Facebook got a lot of negative news coverage in 2019 when the FTC sued them for $5 billion. And what had happened is that they changed some of their privacy policies, and third-party apps were able to access some of the data of people's friends. So this is what happened with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. They were able to go and kind of harvest data from all of my friends on Facebook, which was not, consensual by the friends, and then collect this data and kind of potentially intervene on some political action. So again, this brings up questions about kind of data quality and privacy. So we might want to select a collection of data or individuals that is balanced or representative. I'll define balanced rigorously in a few slides. But we might not be able to explicitly select based on these attributes. So maybe for the gender shades example, they would have liked a data set that was, half men, half women, half white, half black, and naively you could just select based on those qualities. But often this isn't possible. So for one thing, they could be considered sensitive and they could not be collected. So maybe like HIV status was never collected. Attributes could be redacted from the sample, so maybe these data were collected at one time, but then they were removed from whatever data set the model developers have access to. They could be too resource intensive to collect. They might require human annotation, and that might just be infeasible. Or selecting based on these attributes could just be illegal. So for example, we have the recent Supreme Court decision for Students for Fair Admissions, where they determined that Harvard and UNC's race-conscious admissions program violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So in short, affirmative action in those cases was illegal. Now, these universities still might want to have some diversity in the admitted student body. And it's useful to think about whether there's a way to do this without, doing anything illegal and without kind of, just getting around the law. Can we do this in a way that really allows us to collect a diverse sample, but is not selecting specifically based on maybe those racial groups? So we talk about this in a recent paper with Tiffany Dang at Amazon, Michael Kearns, and Aaron Roth, who are my advisors at Penn. It's called Balanced Filtering via Disclosure Control Proxies, and it's in review, but it's on archive now, if you want to look. So for this problem, we take a pipeline approach. We consider a situation where there is actually a small subset of data, or a small set of data with the sensitive attribute available. From that data, we'll train a proxy learner that is going to produce a proxy function, or it will produce a proxy variable, which we can ultimately use for this data collection task. So for situations, we have two main contributions in this paper. For situations where balance is desired, but disclosivity is not a concern, we're going to introduce a sampling scheme that is specifically optimized to produce a balanced data set. And when there are concerns about disclosivity, we present a method to produce a proxy function for the balanced filtering task that is guaranteed not to be too disclosive. So we're not just going to be using zip code in place of race. And again, so what's happening here is we have the data with the sensitive attribute. We're going to train some kind of proxy variable, and then using that proxy variable, now we'll go and we'll look at a new set of data without the sensitive attribute. We'll filter based on that proxy variable and produce what we hope will be a balanced subsample. So I've given some motivation. I'll talk more about the framework, some key definitions, the algorithms we come up with, and then an empirical evaluation. So the framework we'll use, we'll consider a data domain omega that's divided into k sensitive groups. So we'll have non-sensitive features x, a label y, and the sensitive feature z. After this point, I'm really never going to talk about y because we're actually not using it here. It's not the focus, but just for clarity, I include it. We will be using the variable z to indicate group membership. So if there are capital K groups, we'll have z taking on values 1 through k, integers. We will consider, again, we have a small sample S with the non-sensitive features, the label, and the sensitive feature available. And we're going to decide ahead of time a proxy function class z hat. And I'll say kind of what function we choose for this. But kind of from that function class, we're going to produce a proxy function, lowercase z hat, that can be used to collect a much larger data set D, still from omega, such that even without observing z, D is balanced with respect to z. Yeah?
How does the size of z hat compare with the size of k?
The size of z hat with the size of k.
The proxy function class.
Oh. I think when we can look at some of the generalization bounds later, but eventually, so the proxy function class is going to be the set of trees, the decision trees, and I think as k increases, you're going to need a more complex tree for that.
Yeah. What is W in the sample complexity?
You mean here?
Yeah.
Oh, that's just short for width. Yeah. Great. Right, so we're going to find this proxy function z hat that achieves our balancing task, but itself is not too disclosive. So it should not reveal that much about z. Okay, so the way I'm defining balance, I'll say that D, a data set D, is balanced with respect to k groups if the probability, if basically each of those groups make up 1/k of the data set. And I'm going to define a proxy as alpha disclosive. If basically you don't learn that much more about any individual's group membership by using the proxy, then you'd know just from the base rates. So probability z equals k are the base rates. And if, once I see your proxy group membership, if I have like a much stronger belief about your z, your real group membership, that would be a violation. So I want this kind of prior and posterior, if you will, to deviate by no more than alpha. And our proxy will take the form of a decision tree with these disclosure control and balancing properties built in. So the way that this will work is that the set of points classified at each leaf should not be strongly correlated with the protected attribute. That's the disclosure control. And then the set of distributions on the protected attributes at each leaf should be such that the uniform distribution of protected attributes is in their convex hull. And this is kind of weighty. I'm going to break this down and talk about this more later. But again, the idea is that based on the distribution of kind of z values that fall in each of these proxy groups, I'm going to maintain the property that I never learned too much more about your group membership by seeing which proxy group you fall into. And in the end, by sampling strategically from these proxy groups, I should be able to attain a balanced data set.
Can we go back to the last slide? I'd like to know what's the z hat is. What's the difference between z and z hat?
Yeah, so z is the protected attribute. So that could be something like race or sex or socioeconomic level. And z hat is our proxy function, which I guess is a bit of an abusive notation, but it would really be z hat of x equals j. So j here is going to be the proxy group that you fall into. So j could be 1, 2, 3, or 4.
Does that difference between the probability imply some independence between them?
So you're saying that
The alpha disclosure sieve is something related to the independence, or
well, so if we our decision tree just moved you left or right with equal probability, so there was really no relationship between your proxy group and your sensitive attribute, then they would be independent and we would achieve an alpha of 0 here. You'd never learn anything more, but it wouldn't let us do the balancing task. We wouldn't really be adding any useful structure. Yeah, it's a good question. So the way that we'll sample from these proxy groups is we will map each example X to a proxy group with corresponding acceptance probability. So if you get mapped to proxy group 1, then I will accept you into my ultimate sample D with probability row of 1. Same thing for proxy group 2, 3, and 4. So we're going to label the range of the proxy z hat with these acceptance probabilities. And like I said, we'll accept a new sample into our data set with the probability according to which proxy group they fall into. And our goal is going to be to find sampling probabilities row such that the distribution induced on these sampled points is uniform over the protected attributes. So how do we do this? We can write out a matrix A that will kind of show us the distribution of groups that are mapped to each of those proxy groups. And I'm going to call this the conditional distribution matrix. This matrix A is going to have one row for each of the proxy groups, so that would be 4 based on that tree. And it'll have one column for each of the sensitive groups. And if I look at the ith row, I'll call that A sub I, and that'll be the distribution over z values that you observe in that proxy group. And for right now, I'm assuming that our proxy function is static. So later I'll talk about how we actually grow this tree strategically, but it's useful initially to just think about, if we kind of pause this process, we have a tree, how do we assess our progress so far? So when I talk about the convex hull, I'm going to say C of A, and it'll be the convex hull of the rows of A. So the convex hull over these conditional distribution matrices. And I'm going to call our target this uniform vector with 1 over k in each entry. And this is actually fairly arbitrary, so you could go for any distribution over groups here. Maybe you say it's unrealistic for me to find, produce a perfectly balanced data set, but I want something that is like 2/3 men, 1/3 women. You could also set U to be 2/3, 1/3 in that case. So we show that if this uniform vector is in the convex hull of the rows of A, then we can find sampling probabilities rho such that the distribution induced on the sample points is uniform over Z. And the way that we'll do this is we'll solve a quadratic program. So we're going to want to find Q, and if that minimizes the L2 distance between the uniform and Q of A. So these would be the sampling probabilities. We want to see, with the best sampling strategy on this given tree, how close can we get to the uniform? And if we can perfectly get to the uniform, then this will end up being 0. Often that's not the case. And we're going to restrict these Q's to be probabilities, so they sum up to 1, and they're all non-negative. And then kind of from this, we can derive our final sampling probabilities row. And so this is the first contribution. We call this a QP proxy sampling scheme. So, yep.
What if what if your target is not in the convex hull?
So if your target's not in the convex hull, then you'll still find the vector Q that minimizes the distance between the convex hull and you.
Right.
And that'll be kind of the best you can do. So it's not there are many data sets for which it may not be possible to find kind of this perfect sampling strategy. And especially if we're not allowed to grow our tree, if we just have a fixed tree that we're working with, then you may not be able to find a Q that sets this to 0 yet.
Right. If you go back to the previous slide, so like this was stated as a sufficient condition, right?
Yeah.
I was wondering if this is necessary. If you can show that it's not possible to find sampling probabilities.
I think that it is necessary. I think it's an if and only if thing. If you restrict the sampling, if you kind of restrict the coefficients to sum up to 1. So from this, we can develop what I call the QP proxy sampling. So QP stands for quadratic program. You're solving that quadratic program here. And the way that the sampling scheme works is we'll draw a new sample, we'll calculate the proxy group based on the existing tree, and then with the corresponding probability, we'll accept it into the sample. And you can show that if you, for a fixed proxy tree, and a fixed conditional distribution matrix, then if U is in the convex hull of that matrix, then the sampling according to this algorithm produces a balanced data set. Yeah.
Parameter alpha.
That'll come in soon. Yeah. So right now we're only focusing on the balancing property. We're not focusing on the disclosivity property. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you increase the size of the tree, so your convex hull will increase in the size.
Yeah.
Is that correct? So,
Yep, that's what we're gonna do.
And then the disclosure condition is some constraint on the tree?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And one reason that we introduced this without the alpha for right now is that it might not be the case that you are worried about disclosivity or privacy. You might just want to try to collect a balanced data set. And this gives you kind of a more powerful way to do it than if you just sort individuals into groups and then sample uniformly from those groups.
Did I understand correctly? I may have misremembered the formula, but if you set alpha to 0, the balancing becomes impossible.
It's impossible unless you start out with a balanced data set. Yeah. So this is kind of looking at best case scenario for right now. This is what we're going for. So as I think a lot of people have been asking about, how do we actually develop a proxy with this property? So how do we develop a proxy with a conditional distribution matrix such that the convex hull over that matrix contains the uniform vector? So you could just pick a random feature for your proxy. That's probably not going to work. And how can we make sure it's not too disclosive? So what we can do is we can grow a tree systematically. And we present an algorithm that produces an alpha-beta proxy with provable guarantees and strong empirical results. And we'll call z hat an alpha beta proxy if it is alpha disclosive, and if the distance between the convex hull and that uniform vector, the L2 distance, is less than or equal to beta. So this measures how close we are to the balancing task, and this measures the disclosivity level. And we can grow the tree. So we eventually want the conditional distribution matrix A of these sensitive attributes to contain U in the convex hull. So we can strategically split the leaves in this tree to minimize that distance. So as we grow our tree, each time we split a leaf, the conditional distribution matrix A is going to grow. It'll get an extra row. And to reason about this, I'll introduce several geometric conditions that kind of let us go back and forth between this tree-based representation and a convex hull. So here's how you could envision this convex hull working. So this would be a situation where you have three groups, and maybe these are the conditional distribution matrices for leaves of a current tree. This is a tree with 3 leaves, so we have 3 conditional distribution matrices, and eventually we want the convex hull to contain this vector u. So we're going to talk about a vertex for this convex hull. We'll just kind of denote it by a binary sequence. And we'll basically say that we have some function that maps a row in the convex hull to a vertex. So I'll talk about them fairly interchangeably. And we're going to define a splitting function, h, as a function that maps samples kind of to 0, 1. So if I apply a splitting function to a leaf, it's going to map the samples into the left child or the right child. In the paper, we talk about randomized splitting functions, which you need to really solve the optimization problem. But for the talk, I'm just going to stick to deterministic ones. And the way a vertex split works is you're going to have a set of samples at some vertex v. We'll denote those as L sub v. And the vertex split results from applying h sub v to these samples, forming child vertices v0 and v1. So if we go back to this picture, if we apply a split to v, we'll create these new vertices, v1 and v0. And intuitively, what we might want to do is, when we make that split, we want to kind of drag the convex hull in the direction of u. So we would like this vector, v1 minus v, to be in the direction of u minus u prime, which, another way to say that is that we would basically like the dot product to be large. So we can show that this scaled dot product, if this is large enough, then we can decrease the distance between the convex hull to u by a factor of 1 minus gamma. And this allows us to guarantee that we're making sufficient progress at each split. So we're not getting into the cycle where we're just making like minuscule progress and not going anywhere. Another nice thing about this is that now we can write this out as a linear condition and use it to derive a constrained optimization problem. So this will be our objective function. So this optimization problem that we want to solve for each split, we're going to want the split to be such that it kind of goes in the direction of u minus u prime, so we're dragging the convex hull towards u, but we have to make sure that when we do that, we never make one of these 2 child vertices more than alpha disclosive. So now we have this convex program where we're minimizing some objective subject to constraints. We can rewrite this, we can use strong duality to rewrite this in the form of Lagrangian. And then we can solve it using 2-player zero-sum game techniques. And this is so that we can give strong guarantees about this process. You could use your favorite convex program solver, but we use this 2-player game so that we can state theorems and generalization properties. So the way that this zero-sum 2-player game works is that we're going to have one player, the proxy learner, is going to be controlling the splitting function, h sub v. And the auditor is going to be penalizing any constraints that are violated. So if I'm the learner and I choose some splitting function that, I say, okay, this is great, it moves the convex hull in the direction of hue, but if I'm making one of those two child vertices too disclosive, the auditor is going to penalize that. And we will keep iterating until we get to a point where our mixed strategies form an equilibrium for this game, and in particular, the distribution over my H models will give me a solution to that convex program. If one exists. So now we can put this all together. So we've talked about kind of what happens when we have a static tree, and now we want to actually grow this tree to form a proxy. So at each iteration, we're going to solve this convex optimization program to find an alpha disclosive split that makes gamma progress. We'll expand the proxy tree, z hat. We'll recalculate A. It will just keep going until we can't make progress anymore. And because we're constraining each child, each kind of child leaf, child vertex, to be alpha disclosive, it guarantees that the whole tree will be alpha disclosive. And then we can show that in kind of a polynomial number of rounds in beta, log beta, we can get a proxy that achieves kind of, for which kind of the best balancing strategy gets us to within beta of the uniform. This generalizes pretty well. One issue is that the generalization properties depend on the size of the smallest proxy group. So, often we don't want to make these trees too big because they won't generalize. This is kind of how this plays out here. If we try to just keep growing and growing and growing, then it might improve our in-sample performance, but out of sample, it will likely start degrading. So we kind of test our two main methodological contributions. The first one was when we don't care about disclosivity, we want to try to achieve this balanced data set. So we can use algorithm 1 to solve this quadratic program and derive these sampling probabilities. And then we can sample from these proxy groups and obtain, hopefully, a pretty balanced data set. The second one is, again, when we do care about the disclosivity. And using the second approach, algorithm 2, we can learn a decision tree proxy that's guaranteed not to exceed a specific level of disclosivity. So this is the alpha-beta proxy approach. And we compare these against what I'll call kind of a naive approach, which would just be you could use a tree, you could use a multinomial logistic regression model, anything that's binning your samples, and then just take the same number of samples from each group. Right, so that'd be a very intuitive thing, but it is outperformed by this algorithm 1 approach. So the naive ones are what I just described. The QP regression and decision tree proxies will again train either a tree or a multinomial model to bin the samples, but then we're going to use that algorithm where now that we have a proxy and we have a conditional distribution matrix, we kind of derive the optimal sampling probabilities. And then we have the full alpha-beta proxies. And there's a relaxed version where we remove some of the constraints on these coefficients, and sometimes empirically that does well. In order to avoid just having a point on our graph for the naive and QP proxies, we kind of interpolate from just a uniform sampling scheme to this QP proxy scheme. So we do that. And we evaluate this on the bank marketing data set and the adult data set. So the bank marketing data set has about 45,000 samples, 48 non-sensitive attributes, and the sensitive attribute is job type. I think there were 12 sensitive attributes. The adult data set is about the same size, It has 14 non-sensitive attributes and has race as the sensitive attribute, so fewer categories. And so here on the bank marketing data set is a plot that shows kind of how each of these candidate proxies did. So the blue and the black ones are the full alpha-beta proxy approach. So that's when we're trying to both balance and guarantee that we never have more than alpha disclosivity. Any point that's near the origin here, so we want points that are near the origin. So the y-axis is the line of imbalance. That's the distance between kind of the best distribution over groups we can achieve and the uniform distribution. On the x-axis is the disclosivity. So that's just looking at the difference between the posterior and the prior for each proxy group. So generally we see that the alpha-beta proxies kind of Pareto dominate here. The QP decision tree and the naive decision tree are next best, and then the regression models do pretty poorly. We had some trouble with generalization, I think perhaps because of the constraint or the dependence on the smallest proxy group. And then you see a similar performance on the adult data set. So again, the relaxed proxy Pareto dominates all the others. The alpha-beta proxy and the QP decision tree proxy are next, and then kind of the other ones trickle in. And here in the test set, the QP decision tree proxy does best. The relaxed one is pretty noisy, but then the alpha-beta proxy would be next best. And this is a visualization of how these conditional distribution matrices work. So this would be at the very beginning of the process where our tree is just a stump. So we haven't split any samples into groups. Everyone's just in one proxy group. And so the proxy groups are on the kind of y-axis here, and then are the rows, and each of the columns are the sensitive attributes. And this is showing kind of what's the concentration of samples from group 0 in proxy group 0. So here we have a really high concentration of samples from sensitive group 0, which means that the data set as a whole is very imbalanced. And if we go through a few more steps, then we start growing our tree. Our conditional distribution matrix evolves. So now we have 3 proxy groups. And we can see that in each proxy group, kind of a different sensitive attribute is represented. So this is tricky because now the disclosivity is fairly high, right? You can see that if I condition on any of these proxy groups, this distribution is pretty different than this distribution. But this allows us to achieve a much more balanced data set when we sample from it.
Alpha is 0 to 1, right? Alpha is 0
Alpha
to 1.
0 to 1, yeah. Beta also. So here's kind of how the balance of the data set might look before and after filtering. So the red here is the unfiltered data set. So light red is unfiltered train, dark red is unfiltered test, light blue is unfiltered train, dark blue is filtered test. So often, and I think someone alluded to this earlier, not every value of alpha is going to be achievable. Or rather, if we restrict ourselves to a very low value of alpha, we won't be able to grow our tree very much. So when we restrict ourselves to alpha equals 0.1, we really can barely grow the tree. If we relax it a bit to restrict ourselves to alpha equals 0.2, at least in sample, we can come up with a perfectly balanced data set. So experimentally, we see that the alpha beta relaxed, and usually QP decision tree proxy are able to improve balance while lowering disclosivity. And in sample, typically the relaxed alpha beta proxy Pareto dominates, while the QP decision tree proxy generalizes a bit better. And then, so out of sample QP decision tree proxy, a relaxed one performed best, followed by alpha beta. So again, I'll go back to these 2 contributions. So when we don't care about disclosivity, just the QP proxies themselves are quite effective at achieving a more balanced data set than if you just did that naive sampling scheme. And also depending on, yeah, I'll just stick with that. But they have this limitation that you're directly training a classifier for that sensitive attribute, which in many situations might be undesirable or could be illegal. So to completely avoid doing that, our alpha-beta proxies never involve training a classifier that is more disclosive than a pre-specified threshold. And again, when you look at that optimization problem, we're not trying to predict Z, we're trying to develop this tree so that we can kind of sample from these different proxy groups and get a uniform distribution. And we were hoping that when we get these more balanced data sets, that we would see improvements in downstream fairness. So if we would then train a model on this data set, like if you go back to this image case, we would like it to be the case if we train some image classifier on these data sets, that then they have more kind of, they perform more similarly on these different subgroups. And we haven't been able to do this yet, partly because it's very easy for this process to distort the distribution of samples within each group. So you can imagine, as a really simple example, that one way that I could achieve, like let's say that UChicago undergrads are 50% men and 50% women. So I could sample just from UChicago and get a data set that's balanced with respect to sex. But then if I deploy that on the general population, UChicago undergrads probably are not going to be representative of the population as a whole. So now the kind of women in this set are not going to represent US women, and the men are not going to represent US men. So if we could control that distortion, then we think it would really help with downstream fairness. So I'll stop there and can answer questions.
So there was a slide in which, so for the specific problem, you weren't able to grow the tree for alpha equals to 0.1, but you switched to alpha 0.2 and you had a perfectly balanced data set. So I was wondering, like, what property of the problem dictates which alphas would work, and how, like, it is possible that for two different problems, alpha 0.2 would be balanced for one, and alpha very high would be balanced for two. So what do you have any idea of what property of the problem dictates?
Yes, we haven't derived that, but I think we could say something about the kind of feasible, how the kind of alpha and beta interact based on the original distribution over groups. So generally, I think the more imbalanced the original data set is, the harder it's going to be to achieve the final balance. And maybe the more you'd have to relax alpha. And perhaps also the more kind of different groups there are, it's going to be, again, more challenging to achieve them.
I'm wondering how important the decision trees are here. So can I abstract this to an arbitrary function? So you generally want to reweight your training data somehow. Two objectives, balance and non-disclosivity. You just define that as a property of an arbitrary function, train a neural network or anything.
So you want to, so the
objective function on
yeah.
the reweighting of the data.
Yeah, so the decision tree, so the choice of using a decision tree was, I would say it was more because it gave us an avenue to tackle this problem, but there are probably other ways to do it. The tricky thing is that, again, you can, for any fixed decision tree, you can analyze the current distance between kind of the distribution you can get with the best sampling scheme and the uniforms. You can analyze that beta gap, but that changes as your decision tree grows. So I'm sure there are other ways to do it, but be happy to chat more if you have ideas.
Like anytime we do this, like I want to train a classifier to predict an attribute, we need some guarantees on like the set of samples with labeled attributes that we receive.
Mhm.
And so I would expect that the A alpha beta proxy also like inherits some of these like dependencies, but I feel like I missed in your results like where or how we're like I guess where in your results do we get kind of like a sample complexity or something like this?
Let me see if I have them in reviews results. So there's a sample complexity in the sample complexity shows up in the generalization bounds, kind of how many samples you need to get a good, a small generalization gap. And then for the actual progression of the algorithm, I'm just counting the number of rounds that it goes over.
So I guess my core question would be, do we get a gap between algorithm 1 and then the alpha beta proxy in terms of how many samples we need, or?
How many samples you need to achieve a given level of balance? So we didn't analyze that, but probably you would need fewer samples for just the QP approach, because it's less involved, but I haven't analyzed it.
Thank you.
Also, I think I have the same question as the David
Mhm.
before. So, it's about the structure of the tree. So essentially, you just want to create several groups and setting the sampling property, sampling properties, probabilities for each group, right? Trying to make it balanced,
Mhm.
adding up. So can you do it in a not top-down way or in a bottom-up, like trying to? So essentially, if you assign one weight for each data point, you get the largest convex hull, right? And in this case, the beta is like smallest,
But
and
then
alpha is
You're violating alpha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you can like
Right.
combine data
Mhm.
points in groups.
Yeah, you might be able to do that. I think one of the things that we wanted was that, at no point during this process did you violate the disclosivity constraint.
Yeah, so
So
it's
you
like
might
the stopping
kind of have to
condition. Yeah.
redefine it. So
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the way we define it really is only in terms of the final proxy groups. But I think we were envisioning it as something where even if you stop the process early, you couldn't learn that much about the individuals.
So you are always satisfying alpha.
Yeah. And that's again so that at no point are you directly predicting the sensitive attribute.